That ringing in your ears, you have learned to live with it. You assume it is just part of getting older, like the gray hair and the stiff knees, something that showed up one day and never left. Something your doctor shrugged at and called tinnitus, which is really just the medical word for the ringing itself, not an explanation of why it is there. What if the ringing in your ears is not an inevitable part of aging? What if it is your auditory nerves sending you a very specific signal about something your body has been running short of for months or years? And what if two foods you can buy at any grocery store for a few dollars could begin to quiet that sound within 2 to 3 weeks? That is exactly what I am going to show you today. Not for every case of tinnitus. I am going to be clear about the cases where this does not apply and where you need to see a physician immediately rather than try anything at home. But for the category of tinnitus that is driven by nutritional deficiency, the research is specific, the mechanism is documented, and the protocol is simpler than anything you have probably been told. Stay with me because at the end of this video, I am going to tell you the 4 symptoms that mean your tinnitus is a medical emergency requiring same-week evaluation. Missing those signals would be a serious mistake. I'm Dr. Jake Taylor. Write your country in the comments right now. And if you are new here, subscribe and turn on notifications. I make these videos every week for people over 60 who want evidence-based health information they can actually use. Let me tell you about Margaret. She was 71 and had been living with bilateral tinnitus for 3 years, both ears. A persistent high-pitched tone that was always present but became unbearable at night when the house went quiet. She had seen an ENT specialist who had confirmed no structural abnormality, no tumor, no Meniere's disease. She had been told that her tinnitus was idiopathic, which means they could not identify a cause and that she would need to learn to manage it. She came to my practice for an unrelated issue and mentioned the tinnitus almost as an aside. When I reviewed her diet history and ordered a full micronutrient panel, 2 values came back significantly low. Zinc was at the bottom of the reference range. B12 was below it. We addressed both deficiencies through specific dietary additions. 3 weeks later, she described the tinnitus as noticeably quieter, not gone, but reduced enough that she was sleeping through the night for the first time in 2 years. At 6 weeks, she described it as something she was no longer consciously aware of for most of the day. It was still there if she listened for it, but it had stopped occupying the foreground of her attention. She said, 3 years of accepting this as permanent, 6 weeks of eating 2 specific foods, and it changed. Today I'm going to show you the mechanism behind what changed for Margaret and give you the complete protocol starting tonight. Here is the concept that makes the nutritional connection to tinnitus make complete sense. Inside your inner ear are specialized hair cells, microscopic sensory cells that move in response to sound waves and convert that movement into electrical signals that travel to the brain. The brain interprets those signals as sound. When these hair cells or the auditory nerves that carry their signals are damaged or irritated, they can begin generating spontaneous electrical activity. They fire without any external sound triggering them. The brain receives those signals and interprets them as sound anyway, because that is what it always does with signals from the auditory nerve. The result is sound that has no external source. That is tinnitus, not imaginary. Genuinely real neurological activity producing the perception of sound. Now, what causes those nerves to become irritated and fire spontaneously? Many things. Loud noise exposure is the most common. Certain medications, circulatory problems, age-related degeneration. But one cause that is significantly underdiagnosed is nutritional deficiency, specifically zinc and vitamin B12. And here is why both matter. Zinc is directly required for the function of auditory nerve tissue. It acts as a cofactor in multiple enzymatic processes that maintain the electrical stability of sensory neurons. When zinc levels fall, auditory neurons become hyperexcitable. They lower their firing threshold. Small stimuli that would normally not trigger a signal begin triggering signals. And in the absence of any stimulus at all, the neurons can begin firing spontaneously. The result is tinnitus generated from within the nervous system rather than from any external source. Vitamin B12 maintains the myelin sheath, the protective insulating layer that wraps around nerve fibers the way rubber insulation wraps around electrical wire. When B12 is deficient, myelin degrades, nerve signals become unstable, cross-firing in ways they should not, generating phantom signals that arrive at the brain as sound. B12 deficiency is particularly common in adults over 60 because the stomach's production of intrinsic factor, the protein required to absorb B12 from food, declines with age. You can eat adequate B12 and still become deficient if your stomach is no longer producing enough intrinsic factor to absorb it. Both deficiencies produce the same downstream result: auditory nerves firing when they should be silent. There is one more piece of the mechanism worth understanding because it explains why this deficiency is so common in adults over 60 specifically and why it is almost never caught. The standard blood panel ordered at most annual physicals does not include zinc or B12 unless the physician specifically orders them. A standard metabolic panel, a complete blood count, a lipid panel, none of these measure zinc or B12 status. You can be significantly deficient in both for years, while every routine blood test comes back described as normal. This is not a failure of your physician. It is a structural feature of routine preventive screening that was not designed to detect micronutrient deficiencies in the context of sensory symptoms. The connection between tinnitus and these specific deficiencies simply does not appear in the standard clinical workflow that most primary care appointments follow. This is why so many people with nutritionally driven tinnitus are told that their tests are normal and that they will need to manage the ringing as a permanent feature of their life. The tests that were run genuinely were normal. The tests that would have revealed the cause were never ordered. Understanding this mechanism is what makes the foods I am about to describe make complete sense. They are not remedies in any vague sense. They are the specific nutritional substrates that auditory nerve function requires. Now, before the protocol, the 4 situations where you must see a physician before doing anything else. If your tinnitus is in one ear only, not both, see a physician this week. Unilateral tinnitus is associated with acoustic neuroma, a benign tumor on the auditory nerve that requires imaging to rule out. It is not common, but it is serious enough that it cannot be assumed absent. If your tinnitus appeared suddenly, particularly after any head impact, see a physician immediately. Sudden onset tinnitus following trauma can indicate inner ear damage or intracranial pressure changes that require urgent evaluation. If your tinnitus is accompanied by vertigo, significant hearing loss, or a sensation of fullness in the ear, see a physician. This triad is characteristic of Meniere's disease, a specific inner ear condition that has its own treatment pathway and cannot be addressed through nutrition. If you hear a pulsing sound synchronized with your heartbeat, pulsatile tinnitus, see a physician urgently. This can indicate a vascular abnormality near the ear, including arteriovenous malformations or carotid artery disease. If none of these apply to you, if your tinnitus is in both ears, appeared gradually, has no accompanying vertigo or hearing loss, and is not pulsatile, then the nutritional protocol I am about to describe is appropriate to try. And I want to be clear about what appropriate means. It means safe to try, with measurable results expected within 3 weeks if deficiency is the underlying cause, and with a clear instruction to see your physician if no improvement occurs by the end of that period. The 2 foods are pumpkin seeds and eggs. Pumpkin seeds are one of the highest dietary sources of zinc available. A single handful, approximately 30 grams, provides roughly 20 to 25% of the daily zinc requirement. Raw, unsalted pumpkin seeds specifically, not roasted. High-temperature roasting degrades a significant portion of the zinc content, not salted. Excess sodium can worsen tinnitus in people with any circulatory component to their condition by increasing fluid retention and pressure in the inner ear. Raw and unsalted is the requirement, not a preference. Eggs are one of the most bioavailable dietary sources of vitamin B12 available, with the B12 concentrated in the yolk. One whole egg daily provides a meaningful contribution to B12 status, and because the B12 in eggs is bound to protein rather than to the complex molecules in meat, its absorption is somewhat less dependent on intrinsic factor than B12 from other animal sources. For adults over 60 whose intrinsic factor production has declined, this makes eggs a particularly appropriate B12 source. One handful of raw unsalted pumpkin seeds daily, one whole egg daily, prepared any way you prefer, but always with the yolk intact. The yolk is where the B12 is. These two foods together provide the zinc and B12 substrate that auditory nerve tissue requires. Dorothy was 74 and had been experiencing tinnitus for 4 years. She had completed an audiological evaluation, an MRI to rule out acoustic neuroma, and a vestibular assessment. All results were normal. She had been told her tinnitus was idiopathic and prescribed a white noise machine for sleep. When I ordered a micronutrient panel as part of a comprehensive review, her zinc was at the lowest end of the reference range and her B12 was below it. Both had been within the range where standard interpretation says normal, but at levels that research has associated with neurological symptoms. We added the pumpkin seed and egg protocol. At 4 weeks, her tinnitus had reduced in intensity enough that she was no longer using the white noise machine every night. She said, 4 years of tests and a machine. Nobody checked whether my nerves had what they needed to work correctly. Type ring in the comments right now if you have been living with tinnitus and accepting it as something permanent that cannot be changed. I want to see how many people in this community have been where Margaret was. Now, the 4 mistakes that prevent this protocol from working, even in people for whom nutritional deficiency is genuinely the cause. The first mistake is using roasted salted pumpkin seeds. This is the version sold in most snack aisles. It looks identical to raw pumpkin seeds. It is not identical in zinc content after roasting, and the sodium content can actively worsen tinnitus in some people. Check the label, raw, unsalted. These are the only 2 specifications that matter. The second mistake is discarding the yolk. Egg whites contain essentially no B12. The entire B12 content of an egg is in the yolk. Egg white omelets, egg white scrambles, the dietary habit of removing the yolk for cholesterol reasons, all of these eliminate the nutrient you need from the food you are eating. One whole egg with the yolk every day. The third mistake is expecting results in 3 or 4 days and abandoning the protocol before the timeline allows results to emerge. Zinc and B12 deficiency develop over months. Correcting them through dietary sources takes 2 to 3 weeks before neurological function begins to stabilize. The auditory nerves do not quiet overnight because the deficiency was not created overnight. Consistency for a minimum of 3 weeks is required before the protocol can be evaluated. The fourth mistake is continuing to expose the auditory nerves to the damage that drove the deficiency in the first place. If you are consistently in loud environments without ear protection, if your headphone or television volume is chronically high, if you are taking medications known to be ototoxic, aspirin at high doses, certain diuretics, certain antibiotics, the nutritional protocol is working against a continuing source of damage. Protect your ears during the protocol period. Before I get to the 3-week timeline, I want to pause for a moment. If this is explaining something you have been living with and told was just your situation now, subscribe right now. We publish every week. 3 seconds. Subscribe and let's continue. Here is the 3-week protocol with specific expectations for each period. During week 1, begin the daily intake of 1 handful of raw unsalted pumpkin seeds and 1 whole egg. The body is beginning to replenish zinc and B12 stores that have been depleted over months. Do not expect audible improvement during this first week. The deficiency is being addressed at a biochemical level before it can translate to neurological change. Continue regardless. During week 2, maintain the same daily protocol. By the end of this week, if nutritional deficiency is the underlying cause, most people begin to notice moments when the tinnitus seems quieter or less intrusive, not consistently. But the variability itself, the existence of quieter moments that did not previously exist, is the first signal that the mechanism is responding. During week 3, maintain the protocol. By the end of 3 weeks, If the underlying cause is nutritional, the tinnitus should be measurably less intense and less constant. Some people at this stage describe it as something they only notice when they specifically listen for it, rather than something that demands attention throughout the day. That shift from foreground to background is the outcome the protocol is targeting. If after 3 full weeks of consistent daily intake, there is no change whatsoever in the intensity or constancy of the tinnitus, nutritional deficiency is likely not the primary driver of your specific case. At that point, seeing your physician for a full workup, including a formal audiological assessment, is the appropriate next step. Alongside the dietary protocol, 3 supporting measures that affect tinnitus through adjacent mechanisms. Reduce sodium intake. The inner ear contains fluid whose pressure is regulated in part by sodium balance. Excess dietary sodium increases fluid retention throughout the body, including in the inner ear. Elevated inner ear fluid pressure is one of the mechanisms of tinnitus. Reducing processed food intake and cooking without added salt during the protocol period addresses this mechanism. Reduce caffeine. Caffeine is a vasoconstrictor. It narrows blood vessels, including those supplying the inner ear. Reduced blood flow to auditory tissue impairs the delivery of the zinc and B12 you are providing through the dietary protocol. Reducing coffee and tea intake, not necessarily eliminating but reducing, during the 3-week period improves the circulatory conditions in which the protocol operates. Manage silence. Complete silence paradoxically worsens tinnitus perception by removing all competing auditory input. The brain, receiving no external sound, allocates more attentional resources to the internal signal. Low-level background sound, a fan, soft music, a white noise machine, provides competing auditory input that reduces the relative prominence of the tinnitus without masking it entirely. Manage stress actively during the protocol period. Cortisol, the primary stress hormone, directly affects cochlear blood flow and auditory nerve excitability. Research has documented a consistent relationship between sustained psychological stress and tinnitus intensity. This is not a psychological explanation for what is a neurological phenomenon. It is a physiological mechanism. Cortisol-driven vasoconstriction reduces blood supply to the inner ear. Reduced blood supply means reduced delivery of the zinc and B12 you are providing through the dietary protocol. Managing stress during the 3 weeks is not optional background advice. It is a physiological requirement for the protocol to operate at maximum effectiveness. Helen was 66 and working full-time in a high-pressure environment when she began the protocol. Her zinc and B12 were both low. After 3 weeks, she noticed minimal improvement. When I asked about her stress levels during that period, she described them as the worst of the year. When she took 2 weeks of leave and maintained the same dietary protocol, her tinnitus reduced significantly. The nutrients were present. The circulatory environment needed to deliver them to the inner ear had been compromised by sustained cortisol elevation. Reducing stress was the missing condition that allowed the protocol to produce the result it had been unable to produce under pressure. She told me, "I thought stress just made me feel worse emotionally. I did not know it was physically blocking the nutrients from reaching where they needed to go." Let me tell you about William. He was 68 and a retired musician with bilateral tinnitus that he had attributed entirely to decades of concert exposure. When I evaluated him, his zinc was significantly low and his B12 was borderline deficient. He had assumed the tinnitus was from noise damage and therefore permanent. When I explained that noise damage and nutritional deficiency can coexist and that addressing the nutritional component could reduce the portion of his tinnitus driven by nerve hyperexcitability, even if the noise damage itself was irreversible, he agreed to try the protocol. At 3 weeks, he reported a reduction in intensity that surprised him. He said, "I assumed all of it was from the concerts. Some of it was, not all of it. Here is your action plan starting today. Tonight, check the pumpkin seeds in your kitchen if you have any. Confirm they are raw and unsalted. If you do not have them, add them to your shopping list for tomorrow. They are in most grocery stores in the nuts and seeds aisle or the bulk section. Beginning tomorrow, 1 handful of raw unsalted pumpkin seeds and 1 whole egg every day. The timing within the day does not matter significantly. What matters is consistency. For the first 3 days, you will likely notice no change. Do not evaluate the protocol at 3 days. Evaluate it at 3 weeks. If you are currently in loud environments regularly, begin wearing ear protection immediately. This is not optional for the protocol to have a meaningful chance. If any of the 4 warning signs I described apply to you, one-sided tinnitus, sudden onset, pulsatile sound, or accompanying vertigo and hearing loss, see your physician before starting this protocol. You are not simply aging. Your auditory nerves are not simply deteriorating in an inevitable and irreversible way. For a significant portion of people experiencing tinnitus after 60, there is a specific addressable nutritional component that has never been identified because nobody checked for it. Now you know to check. Let me be direct about what this protocol is and what it is not. It is not a cure for tinnitus. Tinnitus from noise-induced hair cell damage, from Meniere's disease, from structural abnormalities, from vascular causes, none of those are addressed by zinc and B12. What this protocol addresses is the specific subset of tinnitus cases where auditory nerve hyperexcitability is being driven or amplified by nutritional deficiency. In that subset, which based on the prevalence of zinc and B12 deficiency in adults over 60 may be larger than most physicians currently recognize, the results can be meaningful and relatively rapid. If the protocol produces clear improvement by week 3, continue it indefinitely. Pumpkin seeds and eggs are genuinely healthy foods with benefits well beyond auditory function. Maintaining the daily habit costs almost nothing and addresses a deficiency that affects far more than just the ringing in your ears. If the protocol produces no change after 3 full weeks of consistent daily intake, book an appointment with your physician and specifically request zinc and B12 blood tests. Tell them you want the tests ordered in the context of tinnitus symptoms. A physician who is familiar with the research will understand the request immediately. One who is not will benefit from knowing that you have done this research and are asking a specific clinical question rather than a general one. Robert was 70 and had been told 3 years earlier that his tinnitus was the result of age-related cochlear degeneration and that nothing could be done. He had accepted this. When a friend mentioned pumpkin seeds after watching a similar video, he brought the information to me skeptically. He told me he did not want false hope. I told him I was not offering hope. I was offering a 3-week trial of 2 foods that cost under $10 total, with a clear explanation of the mechanism and a clear instruction to evaluate the result at 3 weeks rather than 3 days. His zinc was low. His B12 was borderline. At 3 weeks, his tinnitus was, in his words, about half as loud. Not gone, half as loud. He said, "Half as loud changes my life. I sleep now. That is not a small thing. Tell me in the comments, how long have you been living with tinnitus? And has any physician ever tested your zinc or B12 levels in connection with it? I want to know how many people in this community have been through a full tinnitus evaluation versus how many were simply told to accept it as permanent. Write your answer below and tell me where you are watching from. These 2 questions together help me understand both the clinical gap and where this community is located, and both answers shape what I cover next. If this video gave you something that changes how you think about a sound you have been accepting as permanent, share it right now with someone who mentions their tinnitus constantly, who turns the television up because the ringing makes it hard to hear clearly, who lies awake at night because the quiet makes it louder, who has been told by their doctor that there is nothing to be done and has accepted that answer. That person needs this information today. The share takes 10 seconds. The information could change years of their life. I'm Dr. Jake Taylor. Subscribe if you have not already. Take care of yourself, and I will see you in the next video.